targeted towards people of the Asian American and Pacific Islander identity. My name is Ravi Prakash. I am a professor of computer science at UT Dallas, and I'm also the speaker of the Academic Senate. I've been at UT Dallas since 1997, and I identify as an Asian because having finished my undergraduate studies in India, I came to this country as a graduate student. And since then, I've made this my home. So, uh, of course, if you look at the list of panelists we have, a very distinguished list of panelists, you will find that there is no single easy definition of what a nation is. Asia being perhaps the most populous continent on Earth has people that look very different from each other. They have cultures, languages that are very different from each other, but we all share similar values. And those values are not very different from the American values. We all strive towards excellence. We all strive towards uh, a good life for us and our children and everybody around us. So, in that sense, a lot of Asians have made this country our home, and the history of Asians in this country is not recent. A lot of people would think of the 1965 Act, which allowed significantly increased number of migration from Asia based on skills as a turning point. But Asians have been coming to this country for a long time. So without much ado, let me first actually thank the School of Arts and Humanities, the History and Philosophy track, and the Center for Asian Studies for sponsoring and organizing this event. And you will see there's an email sign up and donation page that will be posted in the chat, and you should go to that if you wish to continue to keep in touch with the various teach-ins that have been organized around various issues, starting from last year regarding the Black Lives Matter and violence against people of African American origin. So there's been an excellent series of seminars, and if you want to keep track of all these seminars and tune in to future seminars, that would be an excellent way to do that. And of course, you can always support this series through your donations. So we are going to have a very free-flowing dialogue here, and we would welcome all of you, the audience, to also participate. So please feel free to type your questions in the chat, and we will try to get to as many as we can. So we have a very interesting and distinguished panel, as I said, of 6 participants. Dr. Roy Wu earned his PhD in 2006 in history at the University of Houston, and he's now the history professor at Dallas College Northlake campus and lives in Irving, Texas. And his publications include co-editing Feasted Landscapes, Sustainability in American Topics, and he's contributing towards a book chapter named Natives of a Ghost Country, the Vietnamese in Houston and the Construction of a Post-War Community. In Asian Americans in Dixie, Race and Migration in the South. And he's currently writing a book titled Farm to Freedom, Vietnamese Americans and Their Home Gardens, which is under contract for publication with the Texas A&M University Press. And he and his wife, as I said, reside in Irving, Texas. So welcome, Dr. Wu. And we also have Dr. Salena Brody of UT Dallas. She is the Assistant Dean of Equity, Justice and Inclusion and Professor of Instruction in the School of Behavioral and Brain Sciences. And she serves as the Assistant Director for the Center for Teaching and Learning. She specializes in intergroup contact and prejudice reduction with nearly 2 decades of experience teaching the psychology of prejudice. Her expertise as a scholar practitioner has most recently been featured in the APA press book, Navigating Difficult Moments in Teaching Diversity and Social Justice on National Public Radio and with the Dallas Bar Association. Welcome, Dr. Brody. We have Ms. V. Trang, who currently serves as an administrative associate in the Office of Programs, Accreditation and Assessment. And before she joined this position, she worked in the School of Economic, Political, and Policy Sciences as academic support coordinator. And most importantly, is an alum of UT Dallas. So she has a long association with UT Dallas. She graduated from the Naveen Jindal School of Management with her MBA and BS in Business Administration and Biology. So double major in the two fields. And she's been working at UT Dallas since 2004. And she's held various positions and has been pivotal in lots of things. I can personally say she has been pivotal in making sure that academic governance runs very smoothly at UT Dallas, and we are very proud of that. We have Ms. Sabrina Uy Tesy, and she's a first-year student at UT Dallas, majoring in political science, and she is of Chinese Filipino descent, and she is, of course, eager to share her experience as an Asian American. And she's very passionate about this issue, and I'm pretty sure it'll come through in her presentation. We have Ms. Nabeeha Kazmi. She's a senior studying political science and business, and she's currently serves as a public relations director for nonprofit Panache Youth Society and has served as vice president for Deeds Not Words at UT Dallas. Welcome, Ms. Kazmi. And finally, we have Dr. Gloria Shenoy. She's the director of academic assessment at UT Dallas, and she collaborates with all academic programs on learning outcomes assessment. She holds a PhD in educational organization and leadership with a higher education concentration from University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. So as you can see, we have a very interesting panel here. And let's start with the historian on the panel to provide a context. Dr. Wu, please.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the introduction. I appreciate it, and I'm glad to be here. It's an honor and a privilege to be with this panel. I'm just going to try to briefly talk about Asian Americans and anti-Asian violence in U.S. history as brief as possible, hopefully just for 10 minutes. So just to provide some historical context, I'm going to start talking about U.S. Immigration policies. So our citizenship policies, just real briefly. Then I'll talk about the rise in nativism, particularly after the Civil War, and then transition to talking about Asian Americans taking action, and talk about just a couple of Supreme Court victories, and then discuss about Asian Americans during the Civil Rights era, which you can arguably make the case that it still continues to this very day, and then end with talking about Asian Pacific Americans today and what can we do and how we can connect with the past, particularly with Asian Pacific American civil rights heroes. Okay, all right. So in regards to U.S. immigration and citizenship policies, you can go all the way back to the days of our so-called founding fathers, right? So going all the way back to the Naturalization Act of 1790, just a few years after. Just a few years after Americans defeated the British and gained independence. The Naturalization Act of 1790 created a precedent. It restricted citizenship to, quote, any alien being a free white person, of quote, but been in the United States for 2 years. So in effect, it left out indentured servants, slaves, and most women. This implied that Black and later Asian immigrants were not eligible to be naturalized, but it said nothing about citizenship status of non-white persons born on American soil. So there's a little wiggle room. Fast forwarding to the Naturalization Act of 1870, it essentially barred Asians from U.S. citizenship, and the act was passed during the early years of Reconstruction, after the Civil War, after the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and so in that context, the Naturalization Act has changed to where the federal law would restrict the right of naturalization, to aliens who were either free white or of African nativity in descent. So finally, African Americans with the Naturalization Act of 1870 could become naturalized citizens of the United States. That just recently gained freedom with the 13th Amendment, the abolishment of slavery. In addition, you have the passage of the 14th Amendment and the important equal protection under law clause for citizens, and then 15th Amendment, where African Americans would finally have African American men, I should say, would have the right to vote. So in that context, finally African Americans can gain the right to become naturalized citizens of the United States. But for Asian Pacific Americans, you're going to see things getting worse. So, for instance, Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. That's self-explanatory. I don't really need to explain it. But it was the first immigration law to ban people by race. It would be renewed every 10 years. And the Exclusion Act banned immigration of all laborers from China to the United States and made visits to China and reentry into the U.S. difficult and uncertain. In 1943, excuse me, in 1943, Congress finally repealed the China Exclusion Act in consideration of its ally in the Pacific theater of World War II, thus ending 61 years of official exclusion. But there's a twist. The repeal, yes, finally allowed Chinese to become naturalized citizens at last, but it continued to limit immigration from China to a mere 105 people a year until 1965. Now, after just to go back a little bit here, the 1924 Immigration Act, as well as the 1921 Immigration Act, these were acts that severely restricted immigration quotas. They were racist policies. And the 1924 Immigration Act further reduced the restrictive immigration quotas to 2% of the foreign-born population of each nationality based on the 1890 census. So they didn't even use the latest census. They went all the way back to 1890 because there were fewer immigrants in 1890 than, say, 1920. It excluded all classes of Chinese immigrants as well as other Asians. So you have immigration laws that were racist and restrictive to immigrants, particularly toward Asian immigrants. So you have a history going back to 1790 of racist immigration policies, right? And you're going to see that, unfortunately, after the Civil War, as I briefly mentioned, you're going to see the rise in nativism, right? And so you're going to see, with on one hand, the revival of immigration, particularly from Europe, where you have millions of European immigrants come to the United States between 1870 and 1920. Unfortunately, you're going to see the rise of anti-foreign sentiment. And late 19th century nativism differed in a couple of ways from its antebellum predecessor. First, the target was no longer Irish Catholics, but the even more numerous Catholics and Jews of Southern and Eastern Europe, people whose languages and usually darker complexions set them apart from the native-born majority. Second of all, late 19th century nativism had a pseudo-scientific underpinning. There was, in his view, a natural hierarchy of race. At the top, with the exception of the Irish, were Northern Europeans, especially those of Anglo-Saxon descent. Following beneath them would be everyone else, the French, the Slavs, the Italians, Jews, Asians, and Africans. Social Darwinism, which was popular at the time, was justified, was used to justify the class hierarchy. Well, guess what? It's going to be utilized to reinforce scientific racism. Asians and Asian Americans were exploited for their labor at this time. They were seen as the yellow peril. In other words, they were seen as dangerous, lecherous foreigners, right, who would not only take away jobs from native-born Anglo-Americans, jobs in which they shunned or which they refused to partake. In addition to that, Asian Pacific Americans were also perceived as a social pariah. Not only were they perceived as dangerous, but also they were perceived as a health threat. So obviously you have racist tropes that existed back in the 19th century that unfortunately continue to exist to this very day. All right. And so you're going to see that for Asian Pacific Americans, such sentiments generate proposals to restrict foreign immigration. The treatment of the Chinese provided a precedent. Chinese immigrants had long worked for low hours. Had long worked for low wages under harsh conditions, particularly in dangerous occupations such as mining and railroad construction in the West. And their different culture and their willingness to accept low wages provoked resentment among Native and European-born workers. So you're going to see violence against Chinese laborers increasing during the 1860s and 1870s. The worst anti-Chinese violence occurred in Rock Springs, Wyoming in 1885, when white miners killed 28 unresisting Chinese miners and drove away all 700 residents from the local Chinatown. This would be known as the Rock Springs Massacre. Although the members of the mob were well known, the grand jury, speaking for the white majority, found no cause for legal action. Such communities sanctioned for violence against racial minorities, made mob attacks one of the worst features of mining life. Now, not everything is gloom and and gloom and doom, right? So in other words, going back to what I briefly mentioned, that Asian Pacific Americans would take action. In other words, Asian Pacific Americans would conduct agency, right? They are active agents of history. They're not just sitting on the sidelines and not doing anything about this. So to give you a couple of examples, you're going to see Asian Pacific Americans taking their cases all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and winning their cases. Okay, so for instance, United States versus Wong Kim Ark. This is back in 1898. Wong Kim Ark, excuse me, was born and raised in San Francisco, California. He was born in the United States, but he was denied re-entry to the United States in 1894 after visiting his parents in China. So he took his case to the U.S. Supreme, or his case reached all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and basically what he did was he advanced the concept of birthright citizenship, winning his Supreme Court case that declared a child born in the United States to parents of foreign descent is a U.S. citizen, and thus establishing an important precedent in favor of equality of citizenship. And then fast forwarding to 1944, or during the internment years of Japanese Americans who were incarcerated in prison camps during World War II, you have the passage of the Executive Order 9066 by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, which basically led to the imprisonment of approximately 120,000 Japanese Americans, where they would be placed in prison in internment camps, typically located out in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of a desert or in the middle of a mountain range, and surrounded by armed guards. And so we're talking about Japanese Americans, U.S. citizens, having their citizenship rights being taken away. So what you're going to see is the Executive Order 9066 allowed the U.S. government to detain Japanese Americans and violate their constitutional rights during World War II. Mitsuye Endo would challenge the executive order. She would be the only female plaintiff in the landmark Supreme Court ruling that ultimately led to the closing of the internment camps and the return of Japanese Americans to the West Coast. So once again, you have Asian Pacific Americans taking action. In this case, a young Japanese American woman who was interned, her family was interned, and she's going to resist, right? And her case will be heard by the Supreme Court, and ultimately, she and Japanese Americans will win the case, thus ending the internment years, or this led to the closing of the internment camps. And so you have, once again, Asian Pacific Americans taking action. In addition to Mitsuye Endo, perhaps you heard of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, the segregated Japanese American combat unit during World War II. It is the most decorated unit for its size and length of service in the history of the U.S. military. Japanese American soldiers fought for a double victory. In other words, victory brought against foreign foes, against Nazi Germany and Axis powers, in hopes that it would translate to victory at home against racial discrimination and violence. That's the concept of double victory. Now, after World War II, you're still going to see, unfortunately, anti-Asian violence and discrimination, in not only in government policies, but also in society in general, right? So just to use one example, let's talk about Hollywood, for instance. Okay, let's talk about the filmmaking industry. In fact, even before World War II, you have what is known as Hollywood yellowface. Okay, so perhaps you heard of blackface, where unfortunately you have white actors painting their faces black and their lips red, and they would carry out these racist tropes where it would perpetuate negative stereotypes of African Americans. Same thing is going to happen to Asian Americans, right? So you're going to have white actors portraying Asian characters on the silver screen and perpetuate racist and negative stereotypes of Asian Pacific Americans. I'll give you one quick example: John Wayne as Genghis Khan, right? And so you have, unfortunately, Hollywood yellowface taking place throughout much of the 20th century. Nevertheless, you have Asian Pacific Americans speaking up and resisting Hollywood yellowface. For instance, Anna May Wong. Anna May Wong was born in Los Angeles to second-generation Chinese Americans in 1905, and she is often considered the first Asian American Pacific Islander movie star. Her acting career in the United States and overseas spanned silent and sound film, stage, radio, and television. She constantly challenged racist stereotypes embedded by Hollywood during an era when Asian characters in Hollywood films were typically performed by white actors in yellow face. As far as other aspects of society, let's talk about labor real quickly. Asian Pacific Americans were at the forefront of the labor movement. So once again, they were not just standing on the sidelines. They're going to, in fact, join forces and collaborate with other marginalized populations, particularly in labor, to resist and to advocate for better wages, working conditions, and shorter work hours for laborers. So to give you one example, you have Filipino American labor organizer Larry Leong, who fought for better wages and working conditions for farm workers, and joined forces with Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta to lead the historic Delano grape strike and boycott from 1965 to 1970. Here you have the alliance of Filipino and Mexican American farm workers during the strike, which ultimately led to the formation of the United Farm Workers and led to better wages and working conditions for all farm workers. Moving on to the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement introduced new ways of thinking about justice and equality in the United States, and Asian American leaders drew inspiration from and provided support for Black freedom fighters. In fact, the term Asian American was coined in 1968 by UC Berkeley students who were inspired by the Black Power movement. And you're going to see that students at San Francisco State, at UC Berkeley in the late 1960s, they're also going to participate in student strikes that led to equal education opportunities and the creation of ethnic studies programs. And you're going to have Asian Pacific American activists such as Dr. Grace Lee Boggs, and she, spanning 7 decades of political activism, in fact, she was a strong and strident advocate of Black justice and Asian American movements via nonviolent resistance. Her causes encompass civil rights, feminism, labor, tenant rights, food cooperatives, and the environment. And then you have Yuri Kochiyama. During the civil rights era, she would join. Oh, let me backtrack a little bit. Yuri Kochiyama of Japanese descent. She and her family were forced to relocate to internment camps, by the way, during World War II. After the war, she joined the civil rights movement and forged a formative friendship with Malcolm X, whom she was with in his final moments. In the 1980s, she and her husband pushed for reparations and a formal government apology for Japanese American internees through the Civil Liberties Act, which was signed into law in 1988. So this is the 1988 Redress Act. Her continued dedication to social causes inspired younger generations of Asian Pacific American activists. And their actions, going from Yuri Kochiyama to Dr. Boggs to the 442nd Regimental Combat Team and on, they're going to not only take action, but they're going to create change, right? Change in American society to create a better democracy, a more perfect union, right? So you have, for instance, after World War II, a number of legislative acts that would improve our immigration policies. So, for instance, the 1946 Loose Settler Act, which extended the right to become naturalized citizens to Filipinos and Asian Indians, albeit the immigration quota at the time was 100 per year. And then you had the 1953 Refugee Relief Act, which extended refugee status to non-Europeans. And then the historic 1965 Immigration Nationality Act, right, in the midst of the civil rights movement, repeals the national origins quota system and gives priority to family reunification. And as I mentioned, the 1988 Redress Act, which provided $20,000 of compensation to survivors of World War II internment of Japanese and Japanese Americans. So for Asian Pacific Americans today, we can look back into history and be inspired in so many ways by so many people, right? By so many of our Asian Pacific American civil rights leaders. And so, unfortunately, with the spike in violence toward Asian Pacific Americans today, we have to continue to resist. We have to continue to take action and understand that not only should we celebrate the past, but also celebrate what we do, because we know that one day changes are going to happen. It may take a while. These changes will not occur overnight, but they will happen. So as a result, we need to continue to honor the legacy of Asian Pacific American civil rights heroes and continue to resist and take action. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wu. This is very interesting, and we will come back to you with some of the things that you raised earlier. As I was listening to you, you mentioned the pseudo-scientific underpinning, and it reminded me of a case that I was reading about as I was preparing for this, of an Indian immigrant, Bhagat Singh Thind. I think it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And he claimed to be white, basically. And I'm pretty sure we will have maybe some opportunity to talk about it, uh, where pseudoscientific arguments were used in the opposite direction, right? Uh, and you mentioned in popular culture and Hollywood. And I distinctly remember when I watched the movie Breakfast at Tiffany's, and Mickey Rooney's character was very offensive. But that passed off as comedy at that time and was completely acceptable to people. So we have a long way to go, but I think, as you said, we've already covered significant ground. So at least the trend seems to be positive. But every once in a while, things happen, as we've seen in the last few years, acts of violence. So with that, let's go to Dr. Brody. Dr. Brody, you are the Assistant Dean of Equity, Justice, and Inclusion. That is entirely in your wheelhouse. So we'd like to
Yeah.
hear from you.
Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Vu, for giving us that historical context and really setting up the panelists to talk about our experiences. I wish I could take your class. I want to start by acknowledging the COVID tragedy in India. Over 412,000 daily cases. The pain is reverberating across the Indian American community, and your Indian and Indian American friends, your students, your colleagues are experiencing devastating loss and uncertainty. And so this is just a reminder for all of us to check in on folks as they are really struggling. So my training is in social psychology and specifically the psychology of prejudice. And I should say that my thoughts today are my own and don't necessarily reflect any official view of BBS or of UTD. So the work is professional, but it's also very personal. I've come to this work by way of my own experiences as an Indian American woman who grew up in Richardson, the child of immigrants, in not too far from UTD. I'm so glad to see this teach-in focusing specifically on AAPI identity and experiences, and to see it in the context of a broader set of conversations about white supremacy. The efforts to confront anti-Blackness are intertwined with today's focus on confronting anti-Asian bias and discrimination, specifically because they are both born of white supremacist ideologies. And so the story of Asian American and Pacific Islanders in this country, as Dr. Vu has pointed out, is really beautiful and diverse. And I mean really diverse. When I think just about Indian Americans, one slice of this AAPI pie, we see a heritage country of 29 states and 22 officially recognized languages, with hundreds of other languages less widely spoken. We see religious diversity. We see rigid class distinctions. And as someone who spent most weekends as a child attending Indian functions, as we called them, and parties with Indians who shared my family's background and language traditions, it was almost culture shock when I joined the Indian Student Association as a college student. There were so many traditions and customs and practices and food that were new to me, even just being in the Indian Student Association. We are a diverse people with diverse histories and origin stories, but we do share experiences, some of oppression and some of colonialism. And we have experiences that are shared with being othered, with being racialized, and the devastating consequences of being devalued. Some of us have deep experiences of internalizing white supremacy ourselves. So professor and Vietnamese American writer Viet Nguyen said this, and it really rung true for me. Like many Asian Americans, I learned to feel a sense of shame over the things that supposedly made us foreign: our food, our language, our haircuts, our fashion, our smell, our parents. So that it cuts really deep when something resonates like that with you, just this feeling of being othered and different. I learned almost nothing about the history of Asian Americans until I took an elective in college called the Asian American Experience, taught by an Asian American professor. I cannot emphasize enough how transformative ethnic studies programs are in universities. There's currently a backlash for the kinds of fuller educational programs that highlight the contributions and histories of Black, Indigenous, Asian American, Latinx communities, and others. In particular, with the idea that, as Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell recently wrote in a letter to the Secretary of Education, he called this kind of education revisionist history. So just as we've heard from Dr. Vu about the history and the policies of things that have happened in what is American history, that these are often challenged to be forms of history that are making people anti-American when it is as American as you can get to learn about the history of your country. So for me, taking a course in the Asian American experience was like finding a missing puzzle piece. It was the first time I saw myself, like really saw myself represented and centered in my coursework. I learned about immigration policies and Supreme Court cases that literally shaped my family's origin story. I learned about the contributions, as we have just heard, of Asian Americans who helped build this country while simultaneously being othered, ostracized, and literally excluded from the rights of citizenship in this country. And we've heard examples of extreme violence as well. I learned about the Ozawa and the Thind Supreme Court case then that showed the degree to which courts would uphold white supremacy. So we learned, as we've just discussed here, that citizenship at the time was restricted to white people. And so when we see these court cases where, Ozawa is petitioning for citizenship, arguing that his white skin qualifies him, and the court saying, nope, no, it doesn't. That's not what we meant by white. As Ravi has mentioned, the Thind case where, the court had said, we meant Caucasian bloodlines, and this argument that you hear from Thind in the court, that is, it's clever, right? You mean this bloodline? I got you there. And the court, apparently exasperated by the audacity of individuals of Asian descent to actually demand rights, they respond with, no, we didn't mean you either. You are too different to be an American. And so when you see that, like written out in the Supreme Court opinions, it sets a really clear case of, who counts and who belongs. So that, my friends, is a big part of our history. And, I'm not a historian, I'm a psychologist, but I have found that even in my own teaching, I've needed to incorporate this history into my psychology of prejudice course because sometimes you don't get it anywhere else. We know our worth in our contributions, and it's important to recognize that these contributions have happened alongside a really unnecessary battle to belong. Our histories have been erased, and the legacies, though, are still felt with every othering experience that we have had. So for me, learning about racialized immigration policy, as we've heard about, this changed my understanding of my parents' own trajectory to the United States via Canada, right? So specifically because of this immigration policy. The knowledge that immigration policy limited a whole generation of Asian Americans from entering the US, it hits me hard because it's not faceless and it's not nameless. And this doesn't even include the many other types of immigration stories that people have had, so being a refugee or having your immigration story, intertwined with war. Like this is a diverse group of experiences. So as a psychologist, I could outline the countless experiences that are unpleasant and painful. So from being told to go back, to being called a terrorist, enduring racial slurs and mockery, being confused for other Indian colleagues, being told or asked whether I was really a person of color. There are so many painful ways in which difference has been devalued and experiences have been minimized. I could talk about the harmful consequences of the model minority myth. So at the individual level, for the ways in which financial hardship and poverty that so many Asian Americans experience. That those stories are unseen and ignored in favor of a narrative where we are all wealthy, professionally successful exemplars. At a structural level, we can see how this model minority myth has really been used as a tool of white supremacy to create division. That was the original sort of introduction of this myth into, sort of our public conversation. The Asian American experience is in many ways a paradox of invisibility and hypervisibility in this way. So, as I close, I will return to some of the ideas of others that, when we think about a call to action, we have a choice between solidarity and complicity, right? So how are we going to move forward? How are we going to continue the activism of so many that has been intersectional and has been collective, right, with other civil rights issues? And to really figure out how to tell those histories that have been left behind, to acknowledge and see the diversity of experiences and the intersection of race, class, gender, sexuality, immigration status, and more, and to really make visible the contributions and these stories of oppression that have not been told. I think if we do that, we have a shot that's hopeful, right, for collective liberation and justice. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Brody. As you were talking about the diversity of the Asian population and Asian American population, the thing is, we are diverse, and we are also, the other thing that really troubles me is we are very quick to also adopt the racist beliefs of this country when we get here. You've talked about Indian functions, right? And and we will hopefully get a chance to talk about that. In those Indian functions, I've seen quote unquote Indian uncles and aunties very casually uttering very racist statements about, say, Chinese Americans, African Americans, right? We have picked up on those same deplorable racism and internalized it, right? So, and this history is, if you look at, say, the Italian American immigrants or the Irish, they were discriminated against. And now, very famously, a very senior official in the previous administration suggested that the quotation on the Statue of Liberty, the book, should potentially be modified, right? So you see how quickly we become racists too, right? So it's we give it as well as we get it, right? So in that sense, for racism and discrimination to stop in this country, we have to also learn not to perpetuate it. So as Asian Americans, that's a very important lesson to also internalize. So Ms. Trang, you are in a unique position here, right? You have seen on campus, right? The campus must have changed a lot in the times that you were here as a student to now when you are a very important staff member, right? And maybe the campus reflects how the Metroplex or this country or this region has changed in terms of how it perceives Asian Americans. So I'd really like to hear from you what your take is on this issue.
Thank you, Dr. Prakash, for your kind words. And I am very happy to share my thoughts today. So I came as a refugee to this country. As a child, I came over here when I was 5 years old. And my mom has told me the story of how her journey to escape Vietnam. It was very arduous. She had to try 3 times before she could escape with me the final time. So I very much appreciate all that my mom has done to bring me to this country, and I appreciate all the opportunities that I've been given. So since I am a first generation in college, my mom and I and my brother and sister were the first ones from our family to be to reside to reside outside of Vietnam. So it was quite a challenge to learn English to adapt to the country. So going through school, it was very much there's that Asian mentality. You have to succeed. You have to work really, really hard. And, there's the stereotype of, oh, you're Asian, you're Chinese, you're Vietnamese, whatever you are. You're very smart. You don't have to try that hard. You're automatically very good at math and science and things like that. So growing up, I was I also perpetuated that upon myself. I was like, I'm going to become a doctor, and that's the only career path I'm ever going to have. But once I got into college, it opened up this whole new world. I started out going to majoring in biology and going to pre-med, and then I found out I love the business side. So I found my way into the business school and got my business and my biology, so I wouldn't lose all my my biology credits. So, and then I was given the opportunity to start as a student worker here on campus in the School of EPS, and I just kind of continued my way because I loved just doing administration and the higher ed environment. So it was very different. It was hard conversations with my family to change my trajectory for my career, but for me, it's been very rewarding, and I love working with so many different people across campus, building those relationships and trying to just change the perception that people have. And in I haven't encountered like microaggressions or anything like that on campus, but around the community, I have encountered some, especially in recent years. I'll tell you of one encounter I had. I stopped to get gas one evening, and there were, I think, 2 white men there, and I was alone, and they were the only other people there, and they called me some names, which was very uncomfortable and very frightening because it was almost dark, and it was during a time where people were getting it was very polarized, and it still is, but it was the beginning. So I quickly got my gas and I hopped back in my car. I ignored them and I left. But it reminded me that there's still a lot of work to be done in society to address, the stereotypes and the discrimination. So here on campus, I participated in an ad hoc committee for an ombuds position, and we're in the process of discussing it with the chief of staff. This was a suggestion that's been ongoing through staff council. So I'm hoping with the discussions on this position that we are able to hire somebody and they can also be an advocate for Asian Americans and Asian Pacific Islanders, and just helping guide us through situations that make us uncomfortable, or in society or on campus.
Thank you.
And that's all I have right now.
Thank you. Thank you, Vi. So you did emphasize the need for actions, right? Deeds, and that's a great segue to our next panelist, Ms. Nabeeha Kazmi. She is Vice President for Deeds Not Words at UT Dallas, right? And she is a senior studying political science. So, Ms. Kazmi, if you could tell us how students are mobilizing around this issue.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Prakash, for the wonderful introduction. So I'm going to be focusing on just like the school, the way that we have been mobilizing, and also a little bit about my experience as an immigrant woman of Asian descent. I'd like to point out with the fact that I think UT Dallas as a school itself is so extremely diverse that I'm always awed by the variety of like different languages and cultures and nationalities that we have. And I think it's a very good way of us to be able to see what Richardson and Dallas and the community is and what we can move towards. I think when mobilization first comes to mind, there's so many amazing organizations. It's just Deeds Not Words, and that have been focusing on educating people, and not just that, but also introducing new cultures to others, because we have so many students that come from all around the world, international students that bring their own cultures from them. I can personally recall before COVID when we would have multiple days. Sometimes there would be students that would have little tables filled with just snacks from their own nationalities and countries. I've definitely seen people have like little tea time where they'll hand out cups of like chai and little cookies so that you can just kind of like, you know, showcase their own nationality. People will come speak in regards to it. I've had individuals come in where they're speaking about Dia de los Muertos. They're talking about different religious holidays and even smaller things such as having a poetry night. So you would sit at the plinth and we'd have individuals showcase their talents and speckle in a little bit about their culture and what it means to be who they are and how that's compiling them in there. When it comes to mobilizing, organizations like Deeds Not Words, Deeds is mostly focused on making sure on menstrual equity and ensuring that we have a lot of focus on minorities. But from my experience, I have had the opportunity to go to the Capitol in Austin and be able to speak with representatives and just thank them for all the work that they're doing, because there's so many people that are involved in regulations and bills that we might not even be aware of, but they're constantly fighting for minorities and they're constantly fighting for people who might not have the voice to be able to speak up at that specific power. Moving on to just my experience as an immigrant woman of Asian descent, like V said before, it's very easy to kind of confine yourself into a box coming from like your nationality. I was born in Pakistan, I was raised there. However, I was fluent in English. And funnily enough, when I first came here to Richardson, which is where I first resided, I was put into ESL classes. I was fluent in English and I constantly tried explaining that to my teachers. However, because I was Asian and I was from Pakistan and I did not have any records of being in American schools before, they just assumed that I didn't know how to speak English. So I would sit there and I would read college level books and novels and constantly have high scores hoping to test out of it. But the school had a regulation where you had to be in those ESL classes for 2 years at the very minimum. So that was an interesting experience. I know when we had a conversation about being made fun of different things that we are part of, that's also something that I've experienced. I found that a lot of things that we were made fun of are actually being trends now, whether it's like henna on your hands. Whenever I used to work, we would be told you cannot wear any nose piercings. I can't have any henna on my hands because that's considered unprofessional. So there were often times where if I had religious holidays like Eid or Ramadan, which I'm going through right now, I wouldn't be able to truly celebrate it in the way that I wanted to because I didn't want to lose my job. I remember when I first came in as a sophomore and I transferred into UT Dallas, I was so worried about not fitting in. I had dyed my hair blonde, I was wearing blue contacts, and I was going to join a sorority. And through my experiences, I found out that organizations, and I think when it comes to mobilizing, and I'll mix this in real quick, there are organizations that are simply just focused on mobilizing when it comes to solidarity for minorities or for organizations and individuals. But that doesn't mean that that mobilization stops at just those organizations. Every individual, every organization has the capability of mobilizing in smaller ways. The way that was done for me through Greek life was the acceptance of my religion, my culture, and just who I was. I came in as somebody who thought that she would have to be, blonde and blue-eyed to join Greek life. And throughout my time, I have never felt more free being able to celebrate my own accomplishments and my own culture, because the people around me constantly celebrate it and they encourage me to do so. I think that's the most important part when it comes to mobilizing, being there for your community, and making sure that you don't have to go out of your way to celebrate them, but just to make sure that you're treating them as an equal. I think that's all that I have as of right now when it comes to community engagement within UT Dallas.
Yeah, excellent points. I think you did mention the fact that at universities, UTD is one among them. The environment is much more inclusive than when we step out of the campus, right? And I think a lot of credit for that goes to students who, I would say, it's one of the great virtues of youth is that you are impatient for change. You can't wait long for something to happen, right? And if, as Dr. Wu was mentioning, UC Berkeley, right, was a hotbed for this demand for equity and justice, and all universities, right, Kent State University, comes to mind. So universities have been great engines for change in that direction. And I think students have a great role to play. I also picked up on something interesting that you said, and I hope we can get back to this. The desire to fit in. And sometimes we as Asian Americans feel that we need to explain ourselves. I, as a college student and as a high school student, felt this when I would read English literature. People would just casually drop French and German phrases and would feel no need to explain it. But when Indian writers writing in English would drop in a Hindi or an Urdu term, there would typically be a footnote or some explanation, stop the narration and use that. And then for the first time, when I read Midnight's Children by Salman Rushdie, he just casually drops phrases, sentences in Hindi and Urdu and feels no need to explain. If you are interested, go look it up, right? And that to me was a very interesting change. It changed the equation, right? I don't need to explain it, right? Just like somebody from English or German heritage doesn't need to explain to you. So these are little things, right, that we pick up on and they make a big difference, as opposed to reading the works by V.S. Naipaul, who somehow felt the need to explain everything and justify everything he was doing. So we can see these kinds of things everywhere, right? So thanks for bringing that up as to how just having henna on your hand was something that you had to make a big decision about, right? Uh, and at the same time, now I see uh, when you see student recruitment videos from universities, Rice has a very elaborate video on students celebrating Holi. And apparently that's why you should come there, because we are so inclusive, right? So things are changing, but maybe slowly, not fast enough, but things are definitely changing. So that would bring us to perhaps our freshman, right? Who I guess by my definition, we should be the most impatient for change. And so Ms. Sabrina Uy Tesy, you are a freshman here and you're also majoring in political science. And here is another interesting thing, right? When we talk about Asian and we think about Indians and Chinese, but then we have a Vietnamese American, we have a Pakistani American, we have an Indian American, and now we have a Filipino American, right? Such a diverse palette of Asian Americans, right? So we would definitely like to hear from your perspective, what your experiences and what your position is on this issue.
Definitely. Thank you for the introduction. My name is Sabrina Uy Tesy, and as you already heard, I'm a first-year student at UT Dallas, and I'm majoring in political science. And I would like to touch on some of my experiences and my thoughts about the Asian American experience. So I think to understand the Asian American experience, you have to go back to my origins, and I would like to talk about a little bit about my family. My dad is Chinese and my mom's Filipino. They both immigrated from the Philippines, but my dad's mother and father immigrated from China. And upon coming here, well, they were a part of a nursing program that would train them in order to become nurses in America, and they'd have to gain their citizenship, which was an extensive process. So upon arriving in America, when they met each other and had me and my siblings, it was a very difficult experience for us. Growing up was a little bit difficult. I mean, it was very difficult, but so when I was growing up, throughout my childhood, all the way through high school, up until now, racism has been very much a part of my life. When you're learning in high school about history and about Asian American history, which is something that we touched on earlier in the conversation, there's not a lot that we learn about Asian American history, other than some acts and maybe one or two occurrences in history about Asian Americans. And I find that very disappointing and, unfortunate, because I'm Asian American and immigrants and minorities have a lot of impact on America. And it's sad to see that we don't have our stories shared or our movement shared about our communities and about our struggles, and which is part of the reason why I think that our struggles tend to be diminished and tend to be not spoken about. So I'll touch on a little bit about what my experience growing up. So when I was little, growing up around kids who weren't Asian American and majority white population, I kind of had the sense that they wouldn't understand my perspective or where I was coming from when I talked about my own experiences, and they would often be brushed off. In school, I was definitely made fun of for my Asian American features and things of that sort. And I would often be accused of very racist stereotypes about, eating dogs or stuff like that, which is completely offensive. But I don't think that kids understand the gravity of the the gravity of racist stereotypes and how perpetuating it, often damages other kids' perception of themselves. So I feel like when being surrounded by so many racist stereotypes, I've often internalized those sorts of things. I actually have a story about something significant in my life, and my parents owned Asian fusion restaurant, and you can imagine the racism that would come with that. And being the daughter of two parents that owned an Asian restaurant, I was often accused of putting things in the food that weren't healthy, or ingredients that other people would find weird. And one of those ingredients would be MSG. And I find this topic really interesting because and up until recently, I found out that MSG has a really rooted history in racism against Asian Americans and Chinese Americans in particular. So to define MSG, it's a common amino acid found in foods like tomatoes and cheese, which people figured how to extract and ferment and process to make yogurt and wine. And it adds a lot of flavor to foods and enhances food. And it wasn't up until 1969 where a scientific paper identified MSG as the cause of Chinese restaurant syndrome and warned it would cause burning sensations, facial pressure, and chest pain. And I find it very interesting that it's called Chinese restaurant syndrome, which is probably something that non-Chinese or non-Asian American people would find offensive, but really sparked some racist rhetoric around Chinese Americans and Asian Americans. Something that I really found profound in the Asian American experience also is the bamboo ceiling, which I was trying to educate myself about. And it's a play on the words glass ceiling. And it refers to the limitations that were enforced upon Asian Americans to limit them from achieving great opportunities and great successes. And I feel that oftentimes Asian American experience is reduced to the fact that we are Asian American, that our successes and that everything that we have achieved can be attributed to our race rather than how we progress and how we achieve as individuals. So Asian Americans can't really be separated from their Asian identity because of that. Well, that's all I have for today.
Thank you. You actually raise a very interesting issue of Asian Americans need to be able to tell their own stories, right? And I think it was mentioned earlier as well by Dr. Wu and Dr. Brody about how the stereotypes in Hollywood, right, which are definitely not the true stories, right? But and at the same time, we see, as Ms. Trang said, if you grow up as a child of Asian immigrants, you are expected any profession you want to go into as long as it's doctor or engineer, right? So, which means that, well, then if you're not a journalist, if you're not a novelist, if you're not an actor, how do you quickly reach a large number of people and tell your story, right? Fortunately, I think we are seeing that change happen. We see more and more people, right? You see people like, Bowen Yang or Hassan Minhaj or journalists, right? Writing for the top newspapers. And we see that happen. It will happen slowly, and ultimately it is people like you, the students, who will actually make it happen. So I think in that regard, I think Dr. Shenoy, you have a lot of experience interacting with these students, right? And you have your own stories. So it would be great to hear from you, your take on this issue.
Yeah, thank you, Ravi. So I just want to say that my area of expertise is about student learning and what's happening and how to best teach our students. And so I'll start there and then I'll expand my thoughts a little beyond it. And so when we look at students and we think about, hey, are they succeeding? Are they learning what we hope that they're learning at UT Dallas? Sometimes we think about groups of students. Are women doing better in a certain field or men? Why? And so when we talk about the AAPI community, and as Ravi and Salena were saying, it's a vast group of people that we've grouped into one group, right? At UTD, we actually separate out AA and PI, Pacific Islander and Native Hawaiian, but that's like a very small handful of students. And their experiences are very different, right? If you think about their immigrant path, the religious practices, languages, food, but even within Asian American, if you think about among American, so I'm from Wisconsin, we have a large Hmong population, and the way that they got to Wisconsin, their levels of poverty are much higher than, say, Chinese American in Wisconsin. And so as you're thinking about some of those things, it's hard because it's one statistic that we see, and that doesn't capture everyone's story, right? What Ravi was saying, we need to allow agency for people to tell their own stories. So the Asian American, that term was found in the 60s based on the common experience of feeling invisible and ignored. And it was for political power that that title came about, right? So acknowledging that, but also saying, oh, there's a movement now that says we need to disaggregate some of that data to look at more specific and individual experiences. So one thing that I think UTD could be an area of improvement is just access to data. When I was preparing for this presentation, it was pretty easy to find both student and faculty data, but I could not find staff data. I couldn't figure out how many, like who is composed of our staff, how much staff there is. And so hopefully that's one area that we could be better and just to think about people's experiences at UTD. Another project that I'm involved in at UTD is looking at how new students succeed. So I'm hoping that you've all heard of our QEP and the project Orbit. Our QEP is looking specifically at transfer students, but Orbit is about international transfer, first time in college, and graduate students first time in college, or first time at UTD, right? And so we're trying to, as my team, how do you measure student success? And a part of that, the literature talks about how when you feel like you belong and you matter as a student, you do better, right? But then the big question is, how do you measure if someone belongs somewhere, right? And Salena, you've talked a little bit about that. And I think that's something that for all of us to think about. How do we help our students feel like they belong? Dr. Brody was saying the importance of ethnic studies, and in curriculum design, that's something called mirroring. So if you can see yourself in the curriculum and see your story, that helps you feel like you belong, right? But then for our other students, that teaches them empathy, right? That's a mirror, or sorry, a window where they can see through the curriculum that we're using or what books that they're reading. I think adding to this web of complexity is feeling safe in the light of the violence against the AAPI community during COVID. Between March 2020 and this year, March, over 6,000 incidents have been reported of AAPI hate. 65% of those are verbal harassments, and other times it's physical, right? People are being spat on, being punched. It's really disturbing to see people who look like my grandparents being shoved onto the ground, right? So physical abuse is an obvious action of hate, but there are small things like microaggressions that are happening that make people wonder if they belong or if they're fully human or worthy of respect. Things like being repeatedly asked, where are you from? No, where are you really from? Or being complimented about your English, even though it's your only language that you speak and think and write, right? These are not environments where people can be fully themselves. There's the age-old tropes, whether it's you're the perpetual foreigner, so you're not really American, like you're from somewhere else, or how our men are being emasculated in Hollywood. Or the fact that COVID-19 is being referred to as China virus, or making assumptions about who has coronavirus. And so a lot of those things, I think, are things for us to address as a community. As we think about student success, I think we also need to be cognizant of the norms that we're holding our students up to and ourselves up to. I think in some ways, academia is almost contrary to what Asian Americans are taught to value. You know, in academia, there's a lot of self-promotion, right, to get ahead. And we know that in literature, you know, talking about the good that you've done, your publications, and how awesome you are in the classroom helps you, right? But often in Asian communities, the collective is the most important thing. And so you're not going around bragging about all the things that you've done. And so how do we hold these things in tandem and create opportunities for all students, staff, faculty to succeed? I recently took some bystander training, and their tagline is hate in any form is unacceptable. And one thing that the trainer pointed out is that even if you don't say anything when verbal harassment is happening, because it's often happening very quickly, and maybe you can't jump in and say, hey, stop that, because you're like, whoa, did that just happen? They said that checking in with the victim afterwards to see how they are doing can lessen the trauma. And so as we see unfolding events in the news, as we maybe we hear something happening in our classrooms or on campus, I think as a community, we can, one, acknowledge that that happened, and then collectively check into with one another to see how we're doing. And so I thank you, audience, for being here and listening, and A&H and the other organizations that are helping sponsor this to create space for this conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Shenoy. So this is, remember, we've been talking for over an hour, and you were the first one who actually really brought in Pacific Islanders into the discussion, right? We've been talking about Asian Americans. We've completely ignored Pacific Islanders until now to a great extent. And you talked about, meaning, here's the interesting thing. Hawaii is a part of the United States. Yet, if you all remember when President Barack Obama took his first vacation and he decided to go to Hawaii, Cokie Roberts, a highly respected journalist, very offhand manner said, as if he was going to some very foreign country, right, to vacation as a US president. And therein you see the latent bias that is deeply buried, and we don't even realize, right, as a nation, the biases. Also, this whole where are you from, right, meaning we are subjected to it, and we do it ourselves too. Meaning, I remember when I was a graduate student and I was on campus, and a young woman, also a graduate student, walked up to us. I was walking to my lab with a friend, and she said, "Are you from India?" And I said, "Yes." And then I turned around and I said, "And are you from China?" And suddenly the smile on her face faded. She too was from India. She was from the state of India that borders Myanmar. But I looked at her and I just assumed that she was from China. So in a country like India, this happens, right? And I, as an Indian at that time, was doing it to another Indian as to where are you from, because there's this this idea of this is what an Indian should look like, or this is what an American here should look like, right? And I think we have a long way to go. All of us have these biases inside, right? And we all have to work at it. So it's a long way to go. But I would like to come back to all the panelists, right? And there have been recent events of violence, right? Last couple of years. Some places of worship were attacked, right? People were killed. The Sikh Gurudwara was attacked. People were killed there. Other kinds of things have happened. Chinese American churches have been vandalized and things of that sort. What can universities, what can students and faculty and people working at university staff do to maybe educate the community around us on this issue? Dr. Wu, would you like to go first, maybe? What's the recent trend, or is there any scholarship on what could be done?
Sure. I mean, as far as what could be done, we could, for instance, support Asian-owned businesses and restaurants who have been, unfortunately, heavily affected by the pandemic. And so we need to shop and visit those stores and support those businesses, right? But otherwise, they'll go away. And so we're talking about people's livelihoods, right? These small family-owned businesses who have been in the restaurant industry or in the fashion industry and so on for years and decades, right? And so we don't want to lose those businesses. In addition, we could continue to, students and faculty, right? We could continue to educate ourselves and each other. And this is a wonderful teaching. And so again, it's a privilege to be here. So I'm so glad to be with this UTD community. And so I'm honored to be here. So these teachings are, I believe, are very helpful and educational. And also they provide a space for healing and nurturing, right? And so it's important to not only share our own personal stories, but also just listen and listen to what others have to say or need to say, so that way we can learn from them and hear their stories. Mm-hmm. So I think education, it's obviously important. And finally, in regards to political activism, right? I mean, go online. I mean, just Google AAPI, right? I mean, just go to hashtag stop AAPI hate, and so on. There are a plethora of wonderful AAPI organizations out there that you can assist in a variety of ways, whether it be to participate in marches or provide small donations or just help them market their organizations, all these things. And so there are a variety of ways that we could assist AAPI organizations. And I'll mention one more thing. And support your local community, right?
Mhm.
It's important to support your local community and think global and shop local, right? And so that's how we could help our local communities by supporting them in a variety of ways.
Thank you. So when I look at going into the community and leadership, I can think of two governors of Asian origin, right? Governor Bobby Jindal, right, and Governor Nikki Haley, both of Indian origin. But when I see them in the public sphere, uh, they entered the political mainstream by, to some extent, maybe uh, denying their heritage. Uh, they did their best to suppress the Asian part of their heritage, right? Uh, is that the way? Is that the right? It doesn't seem like the right way to be entering the community. Meaning, if you are depriving this very diverse country of your heritage and you're denying it, what kind of leadership are you exhibiting, and what kind of example are you setting? So do you see, and this is open to everybody in the panelist, do you see people in leadership positions in politics from the Asian American and Pacific Islander community who, and maybe some of them are in early stages of their political career, who are actually going the opposite way, where they're celebrating their identity and making it mainstream?
I'd love to talk about that if anyone
Yes,
else.
please. Yes, yes.
So a little while ago, I was working as a writer for a magazine, and I was able to interview Busha Amiwala. She's one of the youngest women who ran for office within her state. I can't recall which it was right now. But her whole entire campaign was over the fact that she was a Muslim woman who wore hijab, and she was the youngest to be running. And it was really refreshing being able to speak with someone who does not have to, like hide about the fact that she is like from a Pakistani origin or that she's wearing like a hijab. She would actively go out there and do things as normal as any other person who would be working on a campaign would, but make sure that, smaller things like coordinating her scarf. I think she wore like an American flag scarf at one point for 4th of July, and smaller things like that to point out the fact that while she is different, that doesn't mean that she should be treated differently than everyone else. And it was a very big part of her campaign, and she was successful in that. So that would be one aspect that I would really appreciate.
That's wonderful. Meaning, I as an Asian immigrant to this country, right? I've had these insecurities. They're still there, right? I want to fit in. And the question is, to fit in, if I go outside wearing a kurta pajama or a sherwani or whatever, right? The traditional dress, how would I look? And I feel in that regard, the Indian women are much bolder than Indian men in terms of upholding those traditions. Uh, and I admire them for that, right? I don't feel that secure. And so the whole idea is we need to learn to be secure in our own skin, right? Comfortable in our own skin, so that we don't feel that to be in the mainstream, we have to deny our heritage, right? Yes, Dr. Brody.
Yeah, I mean, that rang true to me as well, this pressure to assimilate. But I just also wanted to point out that even if you're like going all in on assimilation as an individual level strategy, that's often not enough, right? That doesn't prevent you from having violence done against you or to be othered and devalued anyway. So, right, in many ways, it's still a losing strategy if there is downward pressure of, white supremacy and racism, right? That, I certainly understand the pressure that any individual feels to want to belong and maybe the pressure to assimilate, but it's still not protective for us. And I think that's been eye-opening to a lot of people in the past year, right? That it's really hard to see that still happen, right? So we want people to be able to express their identities, but even this like, oh, if you just did a little bit more of X, Y, and Z, then things would be okay. And that just has not panned out for people.
Yeah. Regarding, I would like to come back to this whole idea that, and I'm no historian, I just have very passing knowledge of American history. But when I look at how Italian Americans and Irish Americans were discriminated against, right? About 100 years back, right? And they have, Italian Americans were not considered white for a while, right? And now they have, meaning they're in the mainstream. We have several governors and presidents, right, of these heritage. Uh, and then I think of the story being told, and I think of the novel Godfather, and then the movie that was made. Meaning, it starts with the stereotype of the Italian. These are gangsters, right? But the book, and then the way Marlon Brando plays the role of the Godfather, is a family man, which is everybody. It's not Italian, it's not Irish, it's not, and everybody is that, right? And it turns that stereotype on its head. We have a dearth of these kinds of stories being told about Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. And when some people try to tell these stories, we ourselves as a community become very defensive. I remember when Mira Nair, you know, uh, who is a professor at Columbia and has made multiple movies, including The Namesake, the most recent one, about Indian Americans. Uh, Indian American community would get very upset with her when she made a movie like Mississippi Masala, whereas an Indian young woman who came to the US via Uganda falls in love with an African American young man played by Denzel Washington. And they said, why don't you tell stories about doctors and engineers? He said, well, when doctors and engineers of Indian origin start having complicated lives, I'll be there with my camera. I'm a storyteller, I tell interesting stories. So why do we get very defensive when somebody actually tries to show our real lives? As opposed to, as you said, your life is defined in terms of very studious, you're very model citizens and things of that sort. Why are we scared of telling our own stories with all the imperfections, all the warts and everything? If we really want to be accepted for who we are. Yes, we.
So I have two comments regarding. So one comment is regarding traditional dress for your home country. So Vietnamese people, we have what's called ao dai, and I typically wear it during Lunar New Year and for special occasions. So I go to temple and I'm wearing my ao dai, and then I might go to, when things were normal, I would go to the mall or I would go grocery shopping right afterwards, and some people would compliment, ask, oh, that's beautiful, and what country are you from, or things like that, or I would get the exact opposite reaction, and I would get all these weird looks and like, how dare you wear something that's not, jeans and a t-shirt. But I used to feel, kind of ashamed at one point, because I was like, why am I getting so many questions about this? Maybe I should try to assimilate a little bit more instead of wearing this traditional garb. But now I've gotten to the point in my life, I'm just like, whatever, I'm going to wear what I want to wear. This is my tradition, and I think it's beautiful. It makes me feel beautiful, and I'm going to go wherever I want to wearing this. I'm just going to ignore whatever people think. So I wanted to share that. And secondly, at UTD, we have the employee resource groups, the ERGs. And I know before, previously, we had tried to create an Asian American Pacific Islander ERG, but there were some obstacles and we just never got off the ground. So I think that's also something that we can get started again at UTD and kind of bring the community together on that.
Yes, so I think there's a question in the chat from Christine Veras, where she asks, what are the resources available on campus for education and awareness against racism? And are there initiatives to educate and train faculty on how to handle it when it happens in the classroom? So I am pretty sure the Center for Teaching and Learning could potentially play a role in this as well, right, in terms of training faculty. And maybe Dr. Brody, you could talk about it. And then, of course, the employee research group that we mentioned. So if you could, Dr. Brody.
Sure, right. The Center for Teaching and Learning is one avenue we've been doing at the school level some trainings and workshops on inclusive classrooms. But the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion is really the kind of go-to on campus for this. And we have people who can do trainings across campus, and I hopefully have sort of more and more a budget and resources to help the people in ODEI do these trainings across campus. I think that's really important that those folks need to be supported. There's definitely a need, and you see people here, look how many people showed up at this most stressful time of the semester to hear this panel. But that office needs a lot of support in order to do these trainings across campus. So that needs to be a priority.
Thank you. And there's another question from Kim Hill, which is, what steps should students, faculty, and staff follow if they experience racially motivated harassment or assault on campus? And I believe, once again, meaning, of course, we can definitely reach out to say the Vice President of Diversity and Equity and the whole Office of Diversity and Equity if there is that kind of incident. I'm pretty sure the Vice President of Student Affairs, if this happens in a class and is directed at a student or by a student, should definitely be made aware of this. And if there's a student who's doing this, then there is a behavioral intervention issue as well, if there is somebody systemic and dangerous event of that sort that happens. Dr. Shenoy, if you have any additional resources to offer in that regard, maybe not, okay. But we'll definitely find more about this and we will post about it. We are at 1:29. Time has flown. And I thank all of you for taking your time, all the 6 panelists. Thank you so much. And once again, our thanks go out to the faculty in the School of Arts and Humanities, especially the History and Philosophy track, and for the Center for Asian Studies for organizing this. As I mentioned earlier, links have been posted in the chat on how to keep in touch and follow future teach-ins and to make donations if you want to support this endeavor, because resources are needed to make these things happen. They don't happen for free. So please support these initiatives, and we would love to hear your voice. So please participate in these kinds of things. Encourage your friends and your colleagues to participate. And once again, thank you so much for joining us. That concludes this teaching. Goodbye.